It's not about what you achieve, but what you believe. Was that precisely what he'd said, Thaddeus wondered. He'd said so many things over the years they travelled together that much of it was becoming a confusion. Sometimes Thaddeus read books that had been written about those years, and the man and the philosophy, and he wondered where the journalists and biographers and critics were coming from, where they'd unearthed their so-called information, how they'd reached the conclusions they had. Very little of what he read bore any resemblance to the things he remembered. He didn't recall there ever being a philosophy as such. Ways of doing things had emerged over the weeks and months they had learned from experience, and often the suggestions had come from one or other of the group members, but by no stretch of the imagination would Thaddeus call it a philosophy. It's not what you achieve, but what you believe. Yes, that was what he'd said. Not at one of the rallies, but over a meal on a summer night. Afterwards, Al and Thaddeus had stayed on for a last, late drink. Al was flying off somewhere next morning, off in search of another story that might make a book. Those were the days before any of Al's books had seen the light of day. Thaddeus had admired the younger man's energy, but doubted his story-chasing would ever amount to anything. Ideas were one thing, but opportunities were the real deal. "Sounds like he's getting us ready for a change," Al had said. "In what way?" "Don't know. Just does. He talked about belief, not achievement. There's a difference." "Believe to achieve," Thaddeus laughed. "It's a good motto." "Is it? Seems to me it's just a motto. And anyway, that's not what he's saying." Looking back, Thaddeus remembers his young friend as a man waiting for magic to find him, believing in the sunlight, filled with a genuine expectation that someone would come, a white witch, a wizard, casting a spell, bringing him the gifts of joy and the certainty, the offerings in which he hardly dared believe. And then he looks at himself. A man standing on a garage forecourt, stock list in hand, and all the shining unsold second-hand cars. Not that they're advertised as such. They're pre-owned now, as though Thaddeus has been keeping them warm, running them in for whatever lucky punter it is who may walk through the gates on this spring afternoon. His collie dog ambles from behind one of the cars and comes to him. "We all have stories and reasons not to tell them," Thaddeus says out loud, and the dog looks up at him, listening for familiar words like walk or dinner. Not hearing them, his chin sinks back to the ground. Thaddeus rubs the dog's ears and lowers his own head, sinking his face into the dog's coat, breathing the smell of animal life and freedom, each deeply drawn breath a point of recollection and reconciliation. He is aware of two hearts beating, his own and the dog's. He listens, trying to match the rhythms to each other, but the patterns are not the same. One is uncertain, more an erratic throb than a beat. The other is calm and measured, loyal and trusting. He especially loves the smell of the dog's coat, drying in the sunshine after rain. That deep, dark smell, drawn from 1,000 scents unknown to humans. That smell which catches some inkling of the sniffing that dogs do when they become aware of the depth of senses we will never know. A shadow falls across his face, and he looks up. A young woman is standing in front of him, her features masked by the aura of sunlight about her. "You sell cars?" she inquires. "I certainly do." "I'd like to look at one." "You're not really here to buy a car, are you?" "No. I wanted to talk to you." "About?" "Him. Then, about what really happened." "I don't talk about him or then, and everybody knows what happened." "You're a journalist." "Is that a crime?" "The story isn't here. I'd write it sympathetically. There is no story. There's a long pause. How's business? Fantastic. You're the millionth customer we've had this month. That's something about which I'll happily give you a story. Cars that won't sell. I can ladle out heartbreaking stuff about a staff of 4 reduced to 1. I can give you an idea for a headline. The soundless silence. And the first line, if you want. 40 gleaming driverless cars form a silent traffic jam, an image of the new Ireland. See, I've done half the work for you already. Or I can give you an angle. Look down there. 7 4-wheel drives, not one of them more than 2 years old. Each of them an aspiration that crashed in flames. Actually, maybe that's not a good analogy. Each a dream that withered on the vine of illusory success. The young woman laughs. You're impressed, I can see, Thaddeus says. In return for your listening, you get a free keyring. Rummaging in his jacket pocket, he produces a fob and hands it to the young woman. Thank you, she says. I don't like what you're doing or how you try to do it. You can have a cup of coffee if you want, Thaddeus says. But no story. The young woman nods again, and they walk towards the office. Thaddeus draws up a chair and motions her to sit. The dog settles at her feet. Thaddeus pours 2 coffees, takes a packet of biscuits from a drawer, and sits opposite. What was he like? She asks. Thaddeus allows himself a smile, but says nothing. It's just a story at this stage, the young woman says. Then you can make it up. Give it your imagined version. Others have. That's not how I work. Good for you. Thaddeus stares through the plate glass window that frames the 5 miles of countryside. Across distant fields, the haze gives way to memory. He looks back to the mists of spring, to a remembered evening, and sees his father in a garden. I'll tell you a story, he says. The young woman looks at him, but doesn't reach for her recorder. It had been raining all afternoon, Thaddeus begins, but the late light and the evening breeze were sucking the dampness out of the raised drills. My father bent and dug at one last sod near the headland of the garden. Now, he called to me. Bring him out. I was a young boy then, 10 or 11, used to doing things as I was told. But I hesitated. Bring him on, my father said again. The sooner we get this done, the better. You're only prolonging his misery. I turned and opened a shed door. From the darkness, an old collie dog hobbled slowly into the garden. It seemed to me that it was suddenly twilight, and that the warm shine had gone out of the sun. Bring him over, my father called. It'll save us carrying him. I put my hand on the dog's shoulder, and he looked up at me. Come on, I said quietly. I was hoping the animal wouldn't hear or would disobey. But instead he wagged his tired tail, and his eyes brightened, and he struggled in my wake, along the narrow path to where my father stood, crowbar in hand. See, my father said, he can hardly walk. We're doing him the best turn anyone ever done him. The dog held my gaze. He trusted me. The breeze was lifting his long coat. And then it seemed to me that his head exploded. My father had brought the crowbar down heavily. For a moment the dog went on embracing me with his unquestioning look, and then his eyes filled with blood, and then they began to drip, then gush, blood spouting from the bulging sockets, and just as suddenly the legs buckled and he fell. There was no sound, no splitting skull, no breaking bone, no whimper, no bark. I had heard nothing. My father put his boot on the animal's side, jerking the crowbar from his skull. Never felt it, he said. I was mesmerized by the tears of blood dripping on the evening clay. And then with the toe of his boot, my father heaved the dog's carcass into the hole he had dug. For a long time, Thaddeus and the young woman sat in silence. "There's your story," he says. The young woman takes a silent sip from her coffee, picks up a biscuit and stands up. "Thank you for the coffee and biscuit," she says. "Millionth customer, glad to be of service," he smiles. "You've got your ring?" She opens her other palm. The key ring rests in it. Bending, the young woman pats the dog and then walks out towards the road. "If you know of anyone looking for a good car, tell them about us." Thaddeus calls after her. She waves without turning and disappears around the yard gate. Thaddeus sits again on the office step and buries his face in the warm hair of this dog. This dog whose smell reminds him of the smell of that other dog in long ago shining days.